A soft, fluffy loaf of bread begins its life as something completely different, a field of hard, dry seeds that you couldn't chew if you tried. Turning that grain into bread is one of humanity's oldest and most ingenious pieces of technology, a chain of transformations that crush, separate, ferment, and bake. Let's follow a single grain of wheat all the way from the field to the loaf on your table. It all starts in a wheat field at harvest time. A giant machine called a combine harvester rolls through, and in one continuous motion it cuts the stalks, strips off the grain, and separates the hard kernels from the useless straw and chaff. What pours out is raw wheat, thousands of small, tough seeds, each one a tiny package of stored energy meant to grow a new plant. But you can't make bread from whole grains directly. They're too hard, too dense, and locked inside protective layers. Each kernel is really three parts wrapped together: a hard outer coat, a tiny living embryo, and a large starchy core that holds most of the energy. Before wheat can become food, it has to be taken completely apart and rebuilt. That job belongs to the mill. When the grain arrives at a flour mill, the first step isn't grinding, it's cleaning. The wheat is run through screens, magnets, and air currents to pull out everything that isn't wheat: bits of stone, dust, straw, and stray seeds. Then comes a clever step called conditioning or tempering. The clean wheat is sprayed with a little water and left to rest for several hours. This dampens the tough outer skin, called the bran, making it leathery and flexible instead of brittle. That matters because in the next step, the miller wants the bran to peel away in clean flakes rather than shatter into tiny fragments that would end up mixed into the flour. Only after this careful preparation is the wheat finally ready to be ground. Modern milling doesn't use giant grindstones anymore. Instead, the wheat passes between pairs of steel rollers spinning at different speeds, which crack and shear the kernels open. After each pass, the crushed grain is sifted through fine screens that sort it by size, and it goes back through more and more rollers. A modern flour mill isn't one machine, but a towering system of dozens of rollers and sieves stacked floors high. And a single grain may be cracked, sifted, and reground more than a dozen times before it becomes the fine powder we know. Bit by bit, the grain is separated into its three parts. There's the bran, the fibrous outer coat. There's the germ, the tiny embryo of the plant rich in oil. And there's the endosperm, the large starchy center, which is the part that becomes white flour. It's a surprisingly wasteful process by weight. From around 100 pounds of wheat, a mill typically extracts about 75 pounds of flour. Whole wheat flour simply adds the bran and germ back in, which is why it's darker, heavier, and more nutritious. Now, why go to all this trouble to get flour? Because flour hides a secret. The starchy endosperm contains two proteins, and on their own they do nothing special. But the moment you add water and start to mix, those two proteins link together and form a stretchy, elastic web called gluten. The two proteins even have names, glutenin and gliadin, and only wheat and a few close relatives carry them in the right combination. That is the deep reason wheat conquered the world's bread. It is one of the only grains that can trap air and rise into something genuinely light. Gluten is the single most important thing in bread. It is what transforms a wet paste into a living, springy dough. When you knead dough, you're not just mixing it, you're deliberately building and strengthening this gluten network, aligning the proteins into a structure that can stretch and trap air without tearing. No gluten, no fluffy bread. That's exactly why breads made from wheat rise so beautifully, while breads from other grains often stay flat and dense. With the gluten built, it's time to bring the dough to life, and this is where a living organism takes over. Bakers add yeast, a microscopic fungus, along with a little salt. The yeast begins to feed on the sugars in the flour, and as it eats, it releases carbon dioxide gas. Here's where the gluten pays off. That elastic web acts like millions of tiny balloons, stretchy enough to inflate around each bubble of gas, but strong enough not to pop. Over 1 to 2 hours in a warm room, all those trapped bubbles expand, and the dough roughly doubles in size, puffing up from a dense lump into something soft and airy. At the same time, the fermentation is quietly developing the flavors and aromas we recognize as fresh bread. The dough is now alive, gassy, and ready for heat. The final act happens in the oven, where a burst of intense heat locks everything into place. In the first few minutes, the trapped gas expands and the yeast makes one last frantic push, causing the loaf to swell dramatically in what bakers call oven spring. Then the real chemistry begins. As the inside climbs past about 60 degrees Celsius, the starch granules soak up water and swell, while the gluten proteins firm up and set. Together, they convert that soft, stretchy dough into a stable, solid crumb, the light, spongy interior of the bread. Meanwhile, on the outside, the intense dry heat browns the surface through a reaction between sugars and proteins, building the crisp, golden, flavorful crust. The yeast dies, the structure sets, and a loaf is born. But it isn't quite finished. As the bread cools, moisture redistributes through the crumb, and the interior firms up to its final texture, which is exactly why a fresh loaf is best given a little time to rest before you cut into it. So a loaf of bread is really a stack of clever transformations layered on top of one another. A tough seed is harvested and threshed, cleaned and tempered, then crushed and sifted into flour. Water unlocks its hidden gluten, yeast breathes life and air into it, and finally heat sets it all solid. Something you literally could not eat in the field becomes one of the most comforting foods on Earth. That's not just cooking, it's thousands of years of quiet human engineering baked into every single slice. Subscribe for more of the hidden science behind the food you eat.